My name is Kathy Smith, and I'm happy to welcome you to this session. Maybe when you registered, you may have noticed that Scott Jose was planning to be here to moderate this session. He teaches preaching here at Calvin Seminary. He actually was called away to participate in a funeral today of a relative. So I'm stepping in, but he had prepared our guests, and so we will proceed with that, with the questions that he prepared. So I'm so delighted to have Amanda Benckhuysen here, and Karen Campbell, and Sujin Pak, all of them with much to give us advice about the Psalms and from their own teaching and preaching. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in the way they would like to and explain where they're from and what they're about right now. So we'll start with Amanda.
All right. Thank you so much, Kathy. So my name is Amanda Benckhuysen, and I have taught the Old Testament and Psalms particularly for quite some time, about 20 years now, actually, in seminary settings, and now I teach at Calvin College or Calvin University. Do not record that.
It's okay.
I teach at Calvin University. I'm also serving as a part-time pastor of a church right now. So it's an interesting transition for me to move from sort of a full-time academic role where I'm shaping and forming seminary students in the Psalms in a kind of academic but also spiritual and formation kind of way, to now being a part-time pastor who is preaching the Psalms and also engaged in pastoral care. Can I just share one quick story?
Yes, you may.
So I went on a pastoral visit, and this elderly woman was in the hospital. And it was my first, this is crazy. It was my first pastoral visit, like ever. And I sat with this woman, beautiful soul, and I said, I would love to read a psalm with you. And I said, I can choose one, but do you have one that is your favorite psalm that you would like us to read today? And she said, when I was a youth, I was part of a youth ministry where we were told to pick a psalm verse that started with the first letter of our name. And I picked Psalm 56, verse 3. And it's this beautiful verse, which I can't quite remember all the details now, but it was this beautiful verse of comfort. And she said, this is my favorite verse in the Psalms. Psalm 56, verse 3. And then she recited it for me from memory. And I thought, what a beautiful experience for me. I felt so blessed by her. So anyway, that's me right now.
Thanks, Amanda. And now you all have to go home and find that verse that fits with your name and that become your life psalm verse. Karen.
Hi, I think you know a little bit about me already. Karen Campbell from Northern Ireland, from Presbyterian Church in Ireland, and then hopped over the pond to minister at Church of the Servant for 5 years, just across the road. And in 2023, we returned to Ireland. I thought I would be in a congregation, but it didn't happen. I transitioned to working for the Irish Council of Churches. It was a good landing spot. It gives me a bird's eye view of all of Ireland, 15 member denominations, and our strapline is Connecting in Christ. So it's a good spot to be in terms of reconciliation, encouraging working together. We work with the big mainline denominations, Presbyterianism, Methodism, the Roman Catholic Church, Episcopalian, and then we've a lot of migrant Orthodox, so Romanian, Indian, Ukrainian, Greek. So changing Ireland, which is good, and trying to keep all that in balance. So that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Karen. Sujin.
Hi, I'm Sujin Pak. I'm Dean of the School of Theology at Boston University, and prior to that I had worked at Duke Divinity School as academic dean, and my first job was at Garrett Evangelical. So if you're paying attention, those are all Methodist seminaries, so I am a United Methodist. On both sides of my family, I am half Korean. My father is a Methodist professor of worship, actually, and spent his whole career at a Methodist seminary in Korea teaching pastors about worship. I myself am a church historian, so I teach the history of Christianity, particularly in the Protestant Reformation, and I start off with a deep love of the Bible, so I combine those love and I look at the history of biblical interpretation. And so my connection with the Psalms is both personal and academic. My first book is actually a study of the history of a certain set of messianic psalms and how those were interpreted over time. But for me, I know that in many times of my life, the psalms of what I've turned to when I didn't have the words to pray, when I felt so despairing that I was having a hard time struggling to pray, or when you really want to find like kind of that amazing praise. So glad to be here today.
Thank you, all of you. We're glad to have all of you here. We're not going to always go from this order, so I'm actually going to have Sujin take our first question. And the first question is this. Based on your experience, can you identify the top 1 or 2 or 3 misunderstandings or misapprehensions about the Psalms that you have encountered over the years? And if you can't identify some, tell why you deem those views to be slightly or substantially off the mark. We'll start with you.
All right, so among the questions, this one was probably the hardest one for me to think about. I think what I thought about is kind of the 2 extremes that can happen when people approach the Psalms. One extreme is to approach them solely literally, like to always literally pray the Psalms. And for some of the Psalms, that's fine. But some of the Psalms, we might want to ask some questions about that. Particularly, we'll get into larger parts of our conversation about the imprecatory Psalms, the ones that kind of call upon curses upon somebody, or like strong language that sounds rather violent. So I would say, like being careful with the extreme of too literal, but then also there's the other side of that where I think people have been too afraid or timid to embrace the boldness of some of these Psalms. And so I think our conversation today will start to get at some of the answers or some possibilities around finding a beautiful middle ground between too literal and shying away from strong language. So.
Thank you. Karen.
Yeah, 2 very basic thoughts on this. The perception that it's all about praise, tehillim, when in reality there's a lot of pain and a lot of anger, a lot of hurt. So trying to project that into our worship with balance, I think is an important road to go these days. And the other is just through the lens of music. We grew up singing in Presbyterian worship. You start with a psalm, then you sing a paraphrase, then you go to your hymns. That's what I knew. And it was Genevan Psalter, Scottish Psalter, and they were all metered out in the same way, which give the impression that structurally the Psalms are all the same. And what I've come to love about the Psalms is when you look at them, they don't say they must be sung to this tune or that tune. And really, some of them are very messy structurally, and there's just an incredible God-given creativity and freedom in how we can sing the Psalms. So I'm doing my own self-work on being freed up from metrical psalter to different ways of singing the Psalms.
Thank you. Amanda.
Yeah, so I think one of the hard things about the Psalms, and I've seen it as I've taught students trying to preach the Psalms, and I've also encountered it myself as I try to preach the Psalms, is it's poetry. I mean, poetry is hard, right? And poetry works differently than like a didactic, like Pauline letter, or like a story that we might find in Genesis or in the Gospels. Poetry is emotive. Poetry kind of engages us at our heart level, not our head level so much, right? And the propensity is to want to analyze and dissect and diagram the poetry to death. And I have this image in my mind of Robin Williams and Dead Poet Society, telling his students to rip the pages out of their textbook. Like, this is not how you read poetry, right? And I think the thing that I am growing in more and more is, how do we honor this genre to allow it to speak to our heart? And one of the things I was struck by at the service last night, if you attended, is the way that Jared did that so well. He created a frame for us to hear the words of the psalm, "Be still and know that I am God." And so the psalm and the poetry of the psalm actually kind of spoke on its own to our hearts. But what he did is he created a context or a frame for us to hear those words well. And I thought, that's a really good way of thinking about how to preach the Psalms, right? How do we allow the words and the imagery of the Psalms to impact us deeply? So,
Thank you. I'm going to do one more round starting on that end and coming this way, and then we'll change it up after that. And this touches on what you said already, Sujin. You have all spent quite a few years teaching and preaching the Psalms, and inevitably, students and parishioners asked about the imprecatory Psalms, the ones seeking revenge on evildoers, desires for God to break the teeth within their mouths, and all sorts of unpleasantries. How should preachers, teachers, and ordinary believers view and deal with those parts of the Hebrew Psalter, particularly in the New Testament light of a Savior who told us to love our enemies, forgive them, go the extra mile for them?
Yeah. So I think the Psalms open up to us these kind of space for authentic honesty and bold prayer. And yet there's a fine line there. So let me talk a little bit about authentic honesty. Because I believe that God already knows what's truly in our hearts. So if you're really feeling angry, if you're really feeling like you want to curse somebody, if you're really feeling like you want revenge, hiding that from God, let alone hiding it from yourself, probably isn't helpful. So I think the Psalms kind of open up the possibility of you can tell God truly what's in your heart. And in fact, it's not too much for God. And I would argue, in fact, that is the best thing for you to do, because you can't be transformed. You can't move to a place of forgiveness unless you're honest with yourself. And God can handle it. And God's, it's not actually even shameful. I mean, if we can't give it to God, who can we give it to? And who's going to really change our hearts? And so I would say, it's necessary actually to have that honesty, and that if we really understood the character of God, we would know that this is all right, and that it opens up in that space then for real transformation. I also think there's the other side of that is bold prayer. There's many examples in the Bible of bold prayer, like Abraham or Moses, and where they're actually holding God accountable to God's promises and to God's character. And I think we forget how to do that. But apparently, if Scripture shows these examples, that this must be something that actually God desires, that God honors. And so, so that kind of both that honesty about yourself as well as bold prayer. But I think there is the in-between. So prayers or psalms that call for revenge or even seemingly forms of violence or curses might kind of, mar the line between this authentic honesty and this bold prayer. And so on the one hand, yes, they are examples of authentic honesty, but I also think we have to think about their proper orientation. And so in sum, the litmus test for me is this: does praying in this way lead toward your own transformation? Does it lead toward building and moving you towards the gifts and the fruits of the Spirit? And also on the other side of it, does your prayer yield and bear those fruits? And if it doesn't, then you might really want to question, maybe this is not really the way. So that's hard. That means you might make mistakes along the way, but it also means then that humility of recognizing, giving to God the kind of the process that we need in learning to be truly honest with ourselves and finding that place of truly righteous, bold prayer.
Thank you. Karen, on those imprecatory songs.
Yeah, so when we talk about loving our enemies, Jesus' words on the Beatitudes, that's hard when you're brought up in a culture that's very violent. And I'll give you a story that comes to bear on this. During the Enniskillen bomb, I was 12. It happened on Remembrance Sunday. Lots of civilians were killed, and Gordon Wilson held the hand of his daughter Marie in the rubble. She was a beautiful Christian young nurse, and she died after she was brought to the hospital. And by that time, the media were there, and they put the microphone in Gordon's face and said, "What would you say to the people who killed your daughter?" And he said, "Well, I bear them no ill will. I forgive them." And that was wonderful at the time that he was able to say that, but the repercussions of that for people who had lost loved ones meant that any time there was a bomb, any time there was a murder, the media would immediately ask, "Do you forgive your enemies?" Like minutes after, minutes. And there was a pressure on Christians to say, "I forgive," when they weren't ready. So I think what I'm trying to say, yes, we want to forgive our enemies, we want to love our enemies, but there's an incredible amount of work to get there. And if you shortcut it, it actually can re-traumatize, cause more burden, more pain when we are not talking about things like justice. And so the imprecatory Psalms are incredibly important to give that space to work through what do we do whenever there is not justice. And we have to talk about judgment and that God does judge, because I line myself up with Miroslav Volf in Exclusion and Embrace, who talks about in order for us to act in non-violent ways, we need to believe in divine vengeance. Mm-hmm. We do. And that's an unpopular idea in the West. But whenever you've been in places where children have seen their fathers being murdered and people say, well, violence was necessary, we need another way to reframe that. So I think imprecatory Psalms are important to work through. They're unhelpful when it means you get stuck and you're re-traumatizing yourself and you can't move through. But I think they can be incredibly helpful to say, well, this is how I feel about the perpetrators. But what is my prayer then before God, and how do I work that out? So it should be a release. But to get too quickly to forgiveness can be harmful too. So I think we need these words to help give some language to get us to think about matters of justice.
So I listened to Karen's talk this morning and just hearing you talk now. And I think that not all who are in North America, but many, especially who come from privileged backgrounds, I think we don't really maybe understand the kind of duress that would cause someone to curse curse someone else. Yeah, there's a kind of privilege to be able to say, yeah, we shouldn't say those words. We don't need those Psalms. Life isn't that bad. I mean, that's not what we're saying, but in some ways that's what we're saying. And I wonder if we say that because we haven't experienced the kind of pain and the kind of suffering that some people do in this country and around the world. And so I want to be sensitive to that. Like, as I read the imprecatory Psalms, who might be praying this psalm today? For whom is their life? Are they experiencing so much hardship and so much suffering and so much injustice that they are cursing, crying out and praying down curses on the people around them? And largely they're doing it, I think, primarily to get it to stop, right? They want the pain and the suffering to stop. And so I think we want to be sensitive to that. And I think that the imprecatory Psalms invite us to that kind of looking around and lamenting, perhaps, with those who are suffering and those who are experiencing injustice. I think the other piece of it, and I'm just going to name it because I heard Karen say it this morning, but I haven't heard it in this panel. When we pray the imprecatory Psalms to God, like, we have a choice, right? Like, when we are experiencing suffering and injustice, we are in this relationship with God. And what do? Like, do you walk away? Do you say, God, I am done with you, right? Or do you bring all of that angst in your heart before God?
Yep.
Right? And I think when the imprecatory Psalms do is they invite us to bring all of it, even if it's crappy, even if, even if we're wishing terrible things for other people, to bring all that before God, and then to kind of open our hands and release it and say, God, this is yours. Because I can't do this. I can't bring this justice for myself. So I'm going to let go. Vengeance is yours. It's not mine anymore. Yeah. Right? And I think that the imprecatory Psalms allow us to do that. We speak our desire for God to act powerfully to bring about justice in the imprecatory Psalms. So,
can I add one more thing too?
Yes, please.
I wanted to mention, in the history of biblical interpretation of these Psalms, the prior pastors and teachers have struggled with how to interpret these. They're uncomfortable with the language as well, and yet it's scripture, right? It's there. And so one of the ways that they dealt with that, and I think there is some wisdom in this, is that they said, maybe these are prayers that you think of, they spiritualize it, and sometimes over-spiritualizing can be a problem. But I think what the purpose is to say, you really do want to pray against evil in this world. You really do want to pray against wickedness. You want to pray against evil powers and evil systems and evil structures. And we may very well actually rightly want to curse those. And so drawing that important line between sort of systems versus individuals. So when you make it individualized or personalized, I think these become very dangerous. But we actually should, as Christians, pray with vehemence against these evil systems, evil powers in our world, and that these words can actually be very appropriate in that sense.
Thank you, all of you. This time I'm going to start with Karen, if that's okay, and then Amanda and Sujin, and guess what, Amanda, you'll be first on the next one. And then there will be time for questions from all of you as well, okay? But here's the next question. CICW recently did a podcast with the scholar John Goldengay, and I'll just say Scott Jose, who was supposed to be here, is the one who did that podcast, so look that up sometime. But Goldengay says he does not like the term Psalms of Lament, but prefers Psalms of Protest. He claims you don't need any particular religious commitment to lament bad, sad, and ugly features to life. Anyone can lament. But if you're going to protest that these things are wrong, you need someone to protest to. And for believers, that's God. So what are your reactions to that, to what he says? We'll start with Karen.
Yeah, I don't know if we're splitting hairs here between lament and protest, but I think the key idea is, where are these directed to? That's the key idea. Psalm 82 we looked at in our lament project, and it talks about a protest really against God. Are you doing your job or not, God? You say you're the judge, but look at all the injustices in this world. Have you left being sitting in the courtroom and at the dock? Where are you, God? And that's a protest. And what I love about what Jesus did with Psalm 82 is he took it into his context. And he was being accused of blasphemy. The Jews wanted to stone him. And the irony was Jesus used Psalm 82 and quoted it against the Jews and said, in Psalm 82 it says, you're all gods. But if you're all gods, then you should be following the divine nature, and you're not. And that was a very powerful reversal of Psalm 82, where it wasn't directed to God, but it was actually directed to the people in the room. But he was able to do that because Jesus absorbed Psalm 82 in the judgment. And I think that's important. Where does the judgment go? He took it on his own shoulders to the cross. And the one who should never have been judged was judged. The one who should never have died took on death. And so I love that he turns Psalm 82 on its head, takes the full weight of blame so that we can still come close to God in our protest. So I love following these imprecatory psalms. They don't die out in the Old Testament, but they live into the New Testament in amazing ways. And the other one is Psalm 109, the Judas Psalm, and how it travels into the early church in Acts 1. So my thinking is, well, if they have that sense of travel and they last past Jesus' death and resurrection, they must have value for us and be a model for how we protest to God.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, but also your opening statement where you're like, are we splitting hairs here? So I do think a large number of the Psalms of Lament, and certainly, the Psalms of Lament are protest psalms. Like, they're protesting that God isn't acting in the way that the psalmist thinks God should act, right? Like, the psalmist is really calling God out and saying, like, you say you're a good God, where are you? Like, you say you care about justice, how come I'm suffering, right? So I think, though, in that sense, there is definitely protest in some of the lament psalms, but there's also psalms where the psalmist isn't blaming God necessarily for their hardship. They're just naming it before God. So, like, I think of Psalm 130 that says, out of the depths I cry to you, hear my cry, O Lord. And if you read through the psalm, there's no protest, there's no blame, there's no, God, you need to act on my behalf. It's more just, I just need to know you're here. Like, I need to feel your presence. I want you, I want you to know this because I know you love me, and I want you to see my suffering, right? Like, so I don't want to split hairs here, but I do think there is something to what I appreciated about Golden Gay is he kind of gives us pause. Like, we're all thinking, okay, so what is going on in these lament psalms? Like, what is being protested? And I think at times we're protesting that God is not acting, right? And I think those are the ones that are actually the hardest for the church to handle. They struggle with that the most, right? Calling out God to be God.
So it sounds to me that Golden Gay is replacing protest or replacing lament with protest. But I think that it really misses something. So I actually pretty adamantly disagree with this. And it sounds like Golden Gay is saying that lament is like a secular thing, but protest is more theological. And I think actually both of them could be secular and both of them could be theological. Like, lament could just be complaint, just a series of complaint. But that's a secular form of lament, but I think lament as a theological category is this profound scraping out of the soul of really putting it before God. It's a movement. It doesn't leave you stuck and static. It's like a reaching out to God in despair But it's reaching to God. That's the theological kind of form of lament. And likewise, protest could be, he makes the point of who do you protest to, but you could protest to civil leaders and church leaders and government systems and not necessarily be protesting to God. And so that's also a difference between a secular protest and a theological protest. A protest to God is like really demanding God's justice, demanding God to be true to God's character and God's promises. So I think there's like elements of both secular and theological. And at the end of the day, I think actually lament and protest are two sides of the same coin. So I think of this like when I think of myself and my daughters, what's your go-to when you're upset? For some people, your go-to is to get very, very sad. And for some people, your go-to is to get very, very angry. I actually think protest and lament are those two sides. Lament is that sadness that you give to God, and that protest is that anger that you give to God. And likewise, it can be theological or it could be secular.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. Follow-up question. I'm going to start with Amanda this time. Some people, and perhaps some whole traditions, shy away from the notion that it's okay to lament to God, to say God is failing God's people, to ask what's wrong with God, why is God far off? And even in my own experience with preaching and pastoral care, some people, they think it's wrong. And they don't even want to read those Psalms because I shouldn't say those things to God, right? So for you, what theologically accounts for that, and what can preachers and teachers do to overcome this hesitancy?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about this question. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be in covenant relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And I actually think Israel understood it in a way that we have lost that understanding. They understood, like Moses pushed back on God. Abraham challenged God, right? Jacob wrestled with God. I mean, we have all these examples. We have the Psalter, the Psalms, where people are challenging God in some ways, left, right, and center. In the ancient Near East, you had to tiptoe around the gods, right? You didn't want to make the gods angry because you didn't want to rain down their curses on you. But God fundamentally presents himself, reveals God's self differently to Israel. He says, none of that. Like, this relationship is not negotiable. We are in a covenant relationship. My steadfast love endures forever. So bring it, all of it, right? And I think when we shy away from the lament psalms, I think we do it because we think we have to sort of preserve and protect either God's holiness, or we have to have some kind of like what we deem a sanctified relationship with God. But I don't know. I guess I feel like what the Old Testament particularly invites us into is a covenant relationship with God, where God says, look, my shoulders are broad. I can take it, right? Like, so let's hash this out together. If you're mad at me, let's hash this out together so that we have a future together. I don't want us not to have a future together. So I don't know, maybe that's anthropomorphizing God in a way that's uncomfortable, but I do think that ancient Israel understood something about what it means to be in covenant relationship with God that maybe we have lost.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wonder when we think about this question and why we shy away from the notion it's okay to lament God. Is it a contextual based question? And I don't know if this is just Irish or Western thinking, but the definition of God from Anselm of Canterbury, than which nothing greater can be thought of, that God is the greatest. And so if we put words that question that, then we're letting God down. And I wonder in the West, or do we feel the pressure in a secularizing society? We can't talk about how we're disappointed with God when God doesn't come through in the way that we had hoped. I wonder if there's an element of that we have to paint the shiniest version of God always in our worship, and there's a pressure that we don't talk about, and maybe just naming that pressure. I know in our context too, there was probably on the human side, that's the divine side, but on the human side, a fear that if we really begin to lament, we'll fall apart.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to hold ourselves together tightly, and that's easier than just open the pain, because if we open the pain, it might just erupt and really we'll lose control of ourselves, another Western value. And I know that was very much in our culture, particularly during the Troubles. Let's hold it together, stiff upper lip and keep going. And I'm not sure that was healthy in terms of how we did our worship. One group of people that have really inspired me over the years. So before ministry, I was a missionary in Kenya, a music missionary, and part of colonization in Kenya, and a lot of connections, Northern Ireland, post-colonial, Kenya, post-colonial, and the songs were quite superficial. We love you, God, you're the best God, you're our rock, you're our redeemer, da da da, all like that up high, until I rubbed shoulders with the Sudanese. And they were singing deep songs because of their conflict, the diaspora Sudanese in Nairobi. And the Dinka people, I just latched onto them because I thought, what is going on here that you're able to tap in to your pain and stay faithful with God? And the Dinka tribe, the Episcopalian Church, they actually were highly organized in their hymnody. They formed song groups, and the name of their song groups in Dinka was Jolwa Liech, which means God, look back on us, because you've gone ahead and left Sudan behind. And so every group was called God, look back on us. That was their identity, and they weren't afraid to name that. And I just was fascinated that they were able to describe that perception that we've been left behind as a nation. And that really resonated with us as Irish people. You know, you've left us behind. We're always kind of second place to the colonial empires, you know. And that really spoke to me. It is okay. So when you were saying, Kathy, about what can preachers and teachers do to overcome that hesitancy, I think form a God Look Back on Us song group in your church and write those songs of where do we think God is in our context, in our nation, in our country today. And let's be honest about it, because then the broken places will sing.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think people are hesitant to do this, or hesitant to complain or to express their anger to God directly for at least three reasons. First, it may seem like you're lacking faith, that you don't really believe in God, and it kind of displays for others, perhaps even, your lack of faith. And secondly, and maybe particularly in a Calvinist or Reformed setting, this is especially hard. It may also seem like you don't really believe in the sovereignty of God, right? We don't really believe God's all powerful, like you're questioning God, right? And so then it can touch upon those kind of strong beliefs. And then another one is like, it may seem like you're being way too familiar with God. So if that distance of God's otherness and God's holiness, and you acting in this way seems way too presumptuous and familiar. But I go back to what you're talking about, that I think all of those are actually a misunderstanding of the character of God. So whether you want to root it in covenant, or that God is this God who is intimate. God is a God who chose to take on flesh so that God could be that intimate with us and know us so deeply and to intervene so deeply for us. So that kind of God, I don't think, we need to get over our fears of looking like we're not faithful, looking like we're too presumptuous, looking like we're not trusting the sovereignty of God. And I'm a historian of Protestant Reformation, and I kind of see the Protestant Reformation in so many ways in every one of those, not equipping us well. Like this emphasis on faith, this emphasis on the sovereignty of God. And in this emphasis. And then it also roots back to kind of earlier Catholic teachings as too. Like if you go back to Anselm's God can look like an angry, demanding God that you're supposed to be afraid of. And so you need to really keep in awe. And so I think, we really need to work on our understandings of God, because the God I know, like, and experience, when I am in my worst moments and I feel even ashamed of what I'm thinking and feeling, when I finally bring those to God, that's when healing begins. And that God embraces me with compassion beyond my understanding. It's some of the most deepest experiences of my spiritual life I've had, to like be in that kind of depth of despair, or that kind of feeling just so not good Christian, and that God comes and meets me in that very moment and is not threatened by that. In terms of like how to overcome this or how you might teach others, I start with the Bible. Biblical examples, really leaning into those and teaching those boldly about, look at these prayers, look at how Abraham's praying, look at how Moses is praying, look how they're like holding God by the collar and saying, do the right thing, where is your justice? And say, like, if this is what the Bible is teaching us about how you can pray, then what does it also teach us about who this God is and how receptive this God is to our true feelings?
Can I just piggyback on that?
Please.
Yeah, so I've been sort of reflecting on everything you're all saying. And, I think preaching today, there's a lot of pressure in our preaching to make it relevant, right? Like, give me the 3 takeaways, right? And what it pushes us to is to give sort of action steps, like this is what you must do, right? Like our sermons become kind of moralisms for how you now are going to live a good life. Or I don't want to reduce it to that, but I see a few nods, so I know I'm hitting, I'm touching a nerve here. I wonder if we need to do a better job of preaching the character of God. Preaching our covenant relationship with God, and not worry so much about having to give those 3 points of this is what you must do, right? We want people to know God, right? We want people to know God deeply. And so like how can we reintroduce that into our preaching so that we're discipling our congregations to a fuller understanding of the character of God and our covenant relationship with God?
And let me add as well, I think, and also imagine modeling in your preaching the actual activity of lament or the actual activity of righteous anger.
Yeah.
And modeling the fine line of what it looks like to do that faithfully versus and then naming how let's not devolve into this, let's not devolve in demonization, let's not devolve in personal attack. And yet here, and as well as like inviting Bible studies or Sunday schools to actually pray these Psalms together in a kind of bold way. So experiential kind of modeling.
It's really helpful. Thank you, all of you. The next question's a little different. I'm going to start with you, Sujin. Okay. What do you each make of those Psalms? And there are a number of them that make broad and sunny claims to the effect that life for those who follow God always goes swimmingly. The righteous always see rotten people getting their comeuppance, even as they're always vindicated. The children of the righteous will never suffer, never go hungry. Or those places in the Psalms where the writer claims there's just no blameworthy thing within him. Mm-hmm. Or how do you deal with those claims that sound unrealistic and, as Scott put it, too sunny by half?
So my first reaction to that question was, well, there's just as many Psalms where the psalmist is saying, how come the evil people are prospering and I'm doing all the right things and nothing's happening good? So that's my first reaction. But then, yes, there are these Psalms that sound, I think we're uncomfortable with them because it sounds like gloating. It sounds prideful. It sounds arrogant. It also sounds like too high opinion of yourself. And then I go back to like what we inherit from the Protestant Reformation, and Catholic tradition has it too, but this sort of guilt-riddenness that we're so guilt-ridden, and we think, we have to, like, if it's 100% by faith and not by our works, et cetera, that we have to, like, give everything to God, and therefore, we can't actually claim the power of God in ourselves or claim righteousness in ourselves. But I'd actually like to turn that on its head. Like, if you really are made righteous by God's work, then you're made righteous. And you can stand boldly in that righteousness. And so there are instances, so it's, again, this fine line, not devolving into gloating, not devolving into arrogance, but really like saying, you look, God, I have done my best here. I've been righteous. I think of Job also, like, I tell me where I've gone wrong, but otherwise I've been righteous, and I want to see, your righteousness come to earth, And Job's a great example too, because there's parts where Job's really bold and it's not a problem, but there's other times when you can look at the story of Job and he's devolved into relying on himself. So there's that thin line, right, where it's really resting in the righteousness God gave you versus resting in your own righteousness. And that's the fine line. But when you're resting in the righteousness that God gave you, be bold, be confident, claim it.
Yeah, if you're an Irish Presbyterian, we talk about the guilt in our bones. We can't get rid of it. It's just we're always feeling we're not good enough, and there's guilt. So that resonates, the sense of righteousness. And also, there are those psalms that talk about I've done nothing wrong, and what do we do with that? And yet I do think I can think of many examples, murders of civilians where they did nothing wrong. They really did nothing wrong. So there's a place for that that's moderated too. We're not all clean, right? But equally, there are people who had horrible things happen simply because of the colour of their skin or their religion or the place that they were born into. And so we need those psalms. I think too, just always being aware of how our own culture shapes us. So growing up reading Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, when you're in Ireland with green grass and you see the sheep, you have a certain image of what a shepherd does. That's until you hear about shepherding in A&E, the ancient Near East, and what it was like. It was much more risky and dangerous. There wasn't green grass of Ireland. So, you do have to do that cultural work of extricating yourself from your own culture and what does it really mean in that time and in that day. And the final thing I would say is I love Psalm 1 about being the tree planted by the waters, even in the midst of evil. And I love Lewis Smead's book, that everything can be all right, even when it's all wrong. And that's not a prosperity gospel. I think, it's a recognition of there can be shalom even when world is falling apart and your life is falling apart. And I crave that. I crave that Psalm 1 identity of being planted by the streams of living water and knowing life will be all right and all will be well. And I think that's important to hold on to, but not in a superficial way, but in a deep, embodied, planted, rooted in Christ way.
And if you've been watching the painting that's happening,
There we go.
it's Psalm 1. Yeah. It's the tree planted by those streams of water, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Amanda.
I'm pretty sure I have Irish blood in me.
Freckles.
If it's about having guilt in your bones. So my go-to when thinking about, the breadth of the Psalms that we have, and that we do have these sunny, happy Psalms. There are Psalms for all seasons, right? And I really like kind of the lens through which Walter Brueggemann talks about this in his early work. He talks about orientation, Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and Psalms of reorientation. And I think that's actually a helpful way to think about it. There are days when we're like, man, I love Jesus and everything is swell, right? And then you hit some hardship and everything is not so swell. And you find yourself and your faith, you're asking questions, you're having doubts, all of that sense of security that you held when in that moment where you were saying everything is swell is sort of dissipating. And that's when the Psalms of Lament really come into play, right? Like they really speak to us. Oh, now I'm crying out to God because not everything is swell. And I'm feeling lost. I'm feeling at sea in my own faith. And then the reorientation where we come out of that experience with a stronger sense of faith. Like it's not that God makes everything swell again. It's just we've learned how to praise God in the midst of evil, right? Like, and it's not a happy clappy thing. We recognize that God is present here with us, sustaining us, upholding us, caring for us. And we resolve to put our hope in God. And because of that, we can yet praise him. So I think that's a helpful rubric for me when I come along one of those happy clappy songs and I can say, yeah, there are times even in my own faith journey where and it's not like a linear, right? It's circular. There are times in my own faith journey where I'm like, yeah, everything is swell. And boy, am I a good person on top of that, right? But to keep in mind that we don't necessarily stay there. And the Psalms give us kind of that opportunity to explore our faith even when things get hard. And then what does it look like to be reconnected and reconciled with God?
Yeah, that's good. And most people will say that their greatest spiritual growth happened not in a happy clappy time, but came out of those times of trial and difficulty, right? That's pretty typical. I have one more question, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. We're back to John Goldingay. He makes the claim in one of his books that the Psalms contain some of the densest theology in the whole Bible. The densest theology in the whole Bible. What are your thoughts about that? And who would like to go first?
I'll go quickly, and then you can mop up. So whenever I was pastoring and people were going in for very significant operations, one of the Psalms I would use was Psalm 31, "My times are in your hands." And I often think, what does that mean? Particularly for someone who you're not sure, will they come out of this operation? Will they have significant life changes? My times are in your hands. It was a psalm that was used. David Trimble, politician in Northern Ireland who won the Nobel Peace Prize. He brokered the peace agreement. I was minister in his congregation before coming here, and when he died, this was the psalm he wanted read at his funeral. And I just thought, wow, after all you've been through, brokering peace, have your own political party turn on you, and very short political career after that. And it's just such a fickle world, and to be able to say, my times are in your hand, that's dense right there, and rich. So I think there's those kinds of psalms. I was going to think of something else. Yeah, I'll come back to it. Someone else jump in. There's something else I wanted to say, but it's lost. So someone pick up.
Yeah, I can say something. I think the Psalms are not easy, right? We all have our favorite Psalms. Psalm 23, Psalm 46, Psalm 27, Psalm 62, 63. A few others, right? Psalms that we've probably learned as a child and have there's a tune that runs through our heads every time we think about them. And but there are a lot of Psalms that are not easy, and like the imprecatory Psalms and the lament Psalms. But there's other Psalms that were like, huh, really? And I think because of that, they force us to wrestle more deeply with who we understand God to be. What do we understand the character of God to be? They invite us into a deep and rich life with God so I do think there is a density there, but it requires some hard work, right? It requires more than just, I'm going to run through the psalm and then close my Bible and put it away for the day. It requires us to ask, what is a psalm actually saying? What does this mean? What am I saying when I cry out to God? How long, O Lord, how long? Am I saying that God is leaving me in my suffering? And what does that say about God? I think we need to wrestle with those questions, and I think the psalm invites us to do that. And so I do think there is a density there. Martin Luther said that the psalm is like a little Bible.
Yep.
Right? So it contains sort of all the theology that we would find in the rest of the Bible, and 150 psalms. So, yeah.
That's exactly what I was going to comment on. So, Christian theologians across history certainly agreed that the Psalms are one of the key places by which to really understand a lot of Christian theology. Protestants love Romans, so they're going to go to Romans first. But then even the Protestants go to Psalms as the second place. And you think about how saturated the life of the church across history is in the Psalms. If you think of the monastic tradition, where it's very much a meditation and praying of the songs, a singing of the songs, and you see that also in the Protestant Reformation, let alone the writing and keeping the libraries of written works in the Psalms, and how many interpreters interpret commentaries on the Psalms. That's one of the most interpreted book in the Bible. So I'll focus on the Protestant Reformations. They absolutely agree that the Psalms are a little Bible. This is what Calvin says: "I am accustomed to call this book an anatomy of the parts of the soul, for there is not an emotion for which one can be conscious that is not represented in the Psalms as in a mirror." And so then he adds, in short, calling upon God is one of the principal means of securing our safety, and no better example can be found to guide us of how to do this than in the Psalms. It follows then that to the extent that one understands the Psalms, so will one understand heavenly teaching. And Luther says something similar. He says, the Psalter might well be called a little Bible. It is comprehended, and most beautifully and briefly, everything that's in the entire Bible can be found there. And he viewed it as giving practical instruction about how godly saints can deal with their suffering, how they can deal with their distress, as well as how they might express their joy and praise. And so he also calls it a kind of mirror. He says this: the Psalter is the book of all saints. And remember, Luther's talking about the sainthood of all believers. And so he's really wanting to give that Psalter to every believer. And everyone, in whatever situation they may find themselves, can take this word and find in it a bright mirror that can show you exactly what it is to be a Christian. And so I look at the Psalm, and I do think it teaches about faith, it teaches about God's goodness, it teaches about the providence of God, it teaches about penance, teaches about forgiveness, teaches about prayer, lament, worship, practices of remembering the goodness of God, practice of thinking of the kingdom of Christ, faithful action in suffering, faith amid despair, trust amid fear, adoration of God, communal songs of praise and worship, teaches about the virtues of faith, hope, peace, love, patience, meekness, self-control, and kindness. And so if you hear all of those things, you're hearing a doctrine of God. You're hearing a Christology, a doctrine of Christ. You're hearing an understanding of the work of the Holy Spirit of comfort and consolation or protest. You're hearing salvation, sanctification, praise, lament, a life lived in worship of God. So when I think of all that, I think, yeah, the Psalms are pretty dense in their theology.
I'll just jump in. I've remembered what I wanted to say. And it's a forward-facing kind of aspiration with the Psalms. And I don't know if it resonates here, but certainly in the context of where I'm doing my work in Europe. Europe is changing. The European Union, that used to feel very secure and settled, is very fragile now. The Russia-Ukraine war is a major player in that. And, conventions that were agreed are being contravened, and for the first time, I think I'm having to consider what is a Christian response to violence and to might. And I do think the Psalms will help with that because they talk a lot about violence. And so I just wonder, is this where we don't want to go, but I think we need to go as Christians? What is a Christian defense policy? And I'm ashamed to be talking about that, but I think that is just the reality of churches, certainly in Europe. And when you hear about bishops in Armenia in prison and what they're going through, that makes it very real. And we can't ignore what's happening to our brothers and sisters in neighbouring countries. So how do Christians respond to violence? I do think there'll be something in the Psalms that help us navigate that well.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to invite you to ask some questions, and I'm going to bring a mic to you so that everyone can hear well. So who would like to go first here? We'll start in the front, and then we'll work back.
2 questions. Somewhere yesterday, it wasn't really said directly, but it was alluded to in regards to lament, wilderness. I have some thoughts on that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on wilderness. I think of the Exodus. I think of one of you made the comment about, Karen, you made the comment about shepherding in Israel versus Ireland. And the like, but lament and wilderness, thoughts on that and the connections on that.
Well, of course, Lamentations are written when, is it Israel or Judah is like in exile, and under Babylonian captivity. And so I think that kind of wilderness is absolutely like a very important thing to think about. Like we could dig into like, what is that wilderness experience? Or you think about David writing the Psalms, and what is David experiencing at that time? Well, the Psalms that he wrote, he's being persecuted, pursued by Saul, right? He's being outcasted. And so, like really leaning into like what are some of the things that the biblical characters can give us, and thinking about our own wilderness experiences, and then what the biblical examples give us for how to pray in that wilderness, how to respond, how to be faithful, how to be honest.
Anybody want to chime in? Or?
Yeah, I think wilderness, it's a loss of control, really. You don't know where you're going and how long you'll be there, how long it'll take to get out. And so what's important is manna for each day, that you wake up and just say, I have faith, Lord, that you'll give me what I need for today. I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And that's not very comfortable, but maybe it's honest as well. So practicing what is the manna for the day. And it's just such a noisy world at the minute. My ability to be still in my own mind and just hold on to one key thought that'll carry like manna throughout the day is challenging, but that's the work I'm in. So I think, you're naming that place we're in where we're just not in control, and we probably never were in control, but it's very obvious now. We're in a position of real vulnerability, so holding on to the manna is the spiritual practice.
Yeah, I like that.
I'm actually a little curious about, you said you have some thoughts on it. I mean, wilderness is both concretely and metaphorically, it looms large, right? In the Bible. And the wilderness is a place where you're tested. Jesus goes out into the wilderness, right? And encounters the devil there, right? Wilderness is a place where you are formed and shaped. This is where God gave Israel the law to form and shape them as God's people. Wilderness is a place where you hide. That's where David went, right? Like the wilderness functions as a metaphor for our own thirst for God. Like and it's a place where there's a lack of resources and a dependency on God. So it functions in a lot of ways in the Bible. So I'm eager to hear the way you're thinking about the connection between wilderness and lament.
Briefly, just in terms of wilderness, I really like what you said. The man, I can take that one with me. That'll preach us. But in terms of wilderness, what you said, you have to depend on God, and so often, as a pastor, just in my own life, but also in the life of congregants, watching people go into a time of, God, where are you? That's wilderness. And that is where you encounter God. That's where, all three of you are making comments in that regard in terms of really growing. It's not always, to quote you, happy clappy. And to give voice to that has been really important. So that actually leads into my next question. We started the Psalms at our church in September. We're in lament right now. One of the conversations our worship director and I have had repeatedly is, there's no music for this.
Yeah.
There's no music for this. Mm-hmm. And kudos to her, even though she has a bachelor's degree, she's a teacher. She has a really good innate theological sense. She has managed, especially with lament, to pull it together. But one of my colleagues made a comment to me a few years ago, and it was the first time I heard it. We believe what we sing. Why don't we have a broader depth of music, a broader width, depth, height of music that reflects the Christian experience instead of just the happy clappy stuff, which is really easy to find?
Yeah.
Anyone have an answer?
I don't know why, but that's where we're at when we're doing our project on the Lament Psalms in Ireland, and we know it was an underused muscle in the Presbyterian Church, and so we're trying to provide resources, and I think there are ways you can get at it. I think the African American spiritual songs are just made for, just pick a tune and put the word. It really is that easy to get there. And we're doing that in Ireland. Another way of doing it is back to the meter. So things like Amazing Grace, very classic meter. If you put that in a minor key, a lament psalm will work with it. Mm-hmm. So there are ways in, I think, that are not so far away that your congregation will go, well, we're just not going to sing it like that. But there are familiar ways with a little bit of imagination that can get you incrementally towards lament. So I would say, go to hymnary.org, find your common meter, and figure out what could be sung just by making it minor rather than major key. And there's where I'd go.
I was going to say similar. I think there are actually psalms, lament singing, and the African spirituals are exactly they knew exactly how to do that so deeply. Mm-hmm. And so leaning into that is one way. But I think, why do these not exist? I think it does speak to our, if you want to say, primarily white, Western, and Asians do this. Asians sometimes are this way too. Not uncomfortability with raw emotion and real feeling, and so we need to address that. Why are we so afraid of our emotion, and kind of open up the possibility of more of that kind of vulnerability. There's one other thing I was going to say. I forgot it, so maybe if you have something to say.
I was just going to say, in the history of the church, too, the Kyries, right?
Yeah.
We do have, there are settings that maybe not to Psalms, but of lament that I think it's really in the modernist period where we see kind of this obliteration or just where we're not making use of these laments as much anymore, but they're out there. I think you can find them. That's not to say that, CICW should encourage more of this through grants and things like that.
I want to give one example, actually. I thought of it. So using a typical song, but singing it as a lament. So, for example, there was a time in a chapel service at Duke where there had been a real split happening in the church at that time. And Methodist Church, you can imagine what that is. And it was right after some, statement that had been was very upsetting to, various groups of the church. And we had to, and they had put on the program to sing, "We Are One in the Spirit." And I preached that sermon. Actually, I preached that day, and I preached a sermon of lament. And then I'm looking at this going, why in the heck are we singing this song? But when we sang it as a lament. We sang it crying. Because we wanted to be one in the Spirit, and we weren't. And so there's those kinds of Holy Spirit moments that can happen, to take a song that seems like it's one thing and it's actually another thing. And that was just a beautiful moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would love to hear what your favorite psalm to preach is, and or one that you would love to preach on if you haven't been able to, and why.
I love Psalm 84 for so many different reasons. It's traveled all through my life. Valley of Baca being transformed into springs, but also the idea of pilgrimage, which is something we haven't actually talked about much, the Psalm of Ascents, but pilgrimage has become increasingly important for me. It's that idea of crossing thresholds. The Latin for pilgrimage, per agram, means through the fields. So it's like the road is not clear where you're going. You're going through a field. You don't know if you're trespassing on someone else's field. You're cutting new ground. And I think the Psalms help us with that sense of there's just so much we don't know in this world. But we're waiting for God to reveal that next step and the next step. So pilgrimage in the Psalms, I think, is really important for me.
Anyone else want to?
I think briefly, I do like that Psalm 1 of a tree planted by living water. So I haven't preached a sermon on that, but that would be really, I think, powerful. And then there's a psalm that's particularly beloved to me that got me through a very hard time in my life. That's Psalm 34. And it starts off with, "I will bless the Lord at all times." And even just starting with that verse always brought me to tears, because I did not feel like blessing the Lord. And it kind of reoriented me to I will bless the Lord at all times. And then it goes on to talk about, bringing joy. But it starts with lament and sorrow, but then ends with a place in which, God restores and brings back joy. So I prayed that psalm every day for a year because I couldn't pray otherwise. And it kept journeying me through, remember to bless the Lord, give your lament to God, and then come to a place of restoration. And it journeyed me to where I could finally really come to that place of restoration. It didn't mean I didn't get there in those first months or even that first half year. So.
And Amanda, it looks like you're looking for your...
Yeah, no, I got it. Okay.
Good.
Yeah, so I would say Psalm 30. And the reason is because we've been talking a lot about lament, but Psalm 30 is a psalm of thanksgiving. And the Psalms of Thanksgiving are not just general Psalms of Thanksgiving. They are giving thanks to God for something that God has done specifically in response to someone who has cried out to God in distress, and God has acted, right? And one of the things I love about Psalm 30 is that specificity. It invites us to consider, how is God responding or answering our prayers? And obviously, God doesn't always answer our prayers the way we want God to answer our prayers. But can we notice how God is at work in our lives? And then what I love, it starts out individually, like individual testimony. But it's very clear that this individual testimony is taking place in the sanctuary with all of God's people gathered around. Like, this is not the psalmist praying this to God in their bedroom. This is the psalmist bearing testimony to how God is at work in their life among God's people. And then the psalmist goes on to say, because God has done all these great things for me, sing praises. Like, all of you sing with me, sing praises to the Lord, O you his faithful ones, and give thanks to his holy name. And there's an invitation for the whole community to share in the thanksgiving of the psalmist. And I just think there's something really beautiful about that. Both the idea of testimony and the idea that we share in each other's sorrows and we share in each other's joys. And how can we actually act that out within the life of the church? So, yeah.
Okay, we've got a question over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tashara. I'm a third-year MDiv student at Yale Divinity School and ordained in the AME Zion tradition. I love to preach, and in my specific tradition, often we're taught as preachers that we should end with the good news. And so with the Psalms of Lamentation, what I'm hearing here in this conversation is that we should be okay with resting in the lament for a while, staying there for a moment, because there's something that we can pull out of it and something we can understand about our relationship and our covenant with God in that. But my question would be, as one who loves to jump to the good news, and I think particularly about Psalm 39, where it ends, talking about turn your gaze away from me, that I might smile again before I depart and am no more. But then when we get to Psalm 40, it's a psalm of thanksgiving and for the deliverance. So how do we resist the tendency to want to jump to that good news? How do we get ourselves to just rest in the lamentation, assuming that we want to preach the entirety of the psalm, and maybe the next Sunday, if we're in a psalm series, we want to the next Sunday visit the deliverance, but still there's somebody in that congregation who throughout that week will need to hear some good news. So what can we do in the preaching moment to allow room for people to still understand that there's hope for better, but still appreciating the lamentation?
Mm-hmm. I think you're trying to name the dangers of fixing people up and they're all happy and shiny and off you go and be blessed. People, the other danger is where you stay so deep in the weeds that you're traumatizing people and there's no hope, and you don't want that either. You don't want to re-traumatize. I love how some of the Psalms are put together. I think of by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept and remembered Zion, and just a real heartache, an ache of longing of what has happened here. And yet a couple of Psalms later, you get 139, you've searched me and you know me. And I don't think sometimes you can get to that knowing of God without the Babylon experience. I think there's something you learn about God's presence in the darkness, the treasure in the darkness, Isaiah talks about, that you just don't get anywhere else. So I think that's the focus of how do we know God better in the darkness? How do we draw close to God in the darkness? And that's the invitation to stay, because who doesn't want to know God better, right? And if it means what Jesus said, take this cup from me, but if it's not going to happen, not my will but yours be done, the prayer of surrender, to be in close communion with God, you're willing to stand in the fire. That's the treasure. So that's where you need to go.
I really resonate with your question. I think, the biggest temptation is to okay, let's be sad for a little while, but then we're going to be happy, and we're going to, and really it can then start to feel more superficial or not really real or authentic. And so I do think we need to train ourselves to be more comfortable to stay in lament. But then there's the other side, like you don't want to stay there forever. That can be very unhealthy. And so navigating that delicate line is really challenging. So a couple of practices that I use, and I just kind of actually walk my faculty through a time of lament and remembering God's goodness. Because if you know how universities are being hit right now, we've gone through some pretty major budget cuts, and it's very despairing. And there's things that we have to despair or grieve that we've lost because it's not going to be quite the same anymore. I think a lot of institutions are going through that. And so, like, leading them through a time of lament, and then I did turn them to, using biblical examples. It's typical that you have lament, but then there's the call to remember God and remember God's goodness, which is a very powerful thing. That's not like about praise per se. It's just simply remembering the historical goodness of God so that you can remember that in the past, God has been good to you. In the present, God has been good to you. And in the future, God will be good to you. But in doing that, I also said, look, we're going to move to a time of remembering God's goodness. But if you're still in lament, stay in lament. I mean, you don't need to make that movement. So, because I invited them to share, we had several moments, 30 minutes of lament, and then we moved to this time of goodness. But some of them stayed in a time of lament, and I really opened up that space, because maybe it's too soon to move to that for them. The other side of that is to say, just understanding that for some people, lament is they're not ready for it. So then also saying in that space, if this is just not where you are or where you're ready for things, or if this is triggering you, or if this is harmful for you, you are free to leave and to find your own way of doing this. So I think it's just really important as leaders to open up and recognize people are at different places. And so kind of give those variations of possibility for people then to participate in the ways that is really going to be life-giving to them.
Mm-hmm.
Free to leave what?
Free to leave the room while we're doing the lament. Or, yeah.
Yeah, so your question made me think of every church or every pastor and their worship team as they plan Good Friday service, and they're wondering whether they put cookies out after the service. What do we do? How do we leave it in lament? We know Easter is coming. How do we do this well? Man, I really loved, Karen, what you said. I think you can, most Psalms move from lament to praise, but one of the most powerful lament Psalms is Psalm 88, which doesn't move from lament to praise, and it ends with "Darkness is my only friend." And I think you can pair that with, "But Jesus entered our darkness," right? So there's this notion that, the lament isn't gone, but boy, God is with us in Jesus, and that's powerful. And you can stay there for a while. And that's gospel, but it's not lifting the lament, right? It's not moving on from the lament too quickly. What I will say is, what I've done in a church that I was part of in the past is, if we had services that we knew were going to be sensitive and hard for people, we would put an announcement in the bulletin and just say, we want you to know that next week we will be having a lament service. And that sort of empowers people to use their own discernment about whether they can be in that space even, so that they're not traumatized, or are they ready to enter into a space of lament with other people if they're not in that space. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just empowering people and giving them the ability to make good choices for themselves.
Can I piggyback one thing on that? So I think actually Easter is a great opportunity to help train the church to be able to stay in a time of lament, because Resurrection Day will come, right? So don't move to that lament on Good Friday. Don't move to that resurrection on Good Friday. Stay there for 3 days. And stay there through Holy Saturday. And it's it's a good opportunity to stay in, because you know that the good message will come. But, anyway, so it's one of those prime liturgical opportunities to really practice that.
And I was just going to mention that you don't have to do all the work in the sermon. The liturgy also can provide those other messages, a prayer or a song or something after the sermon that maybe can hint at the good news that you want them to hear. I'll take one more question and then we'll be finished with our time.
The pushback that I get in asking people to lament or to say their anger to God or the anger they have to somebody else, there's a lot to say about that, but it's a deeper problem than helping them think that the Bible tells us to do that and all that. Because at bottom, I think people in my tradition think that just feeling anger is sinful. So they've been repressing it all their life and telling something, I'm upset, but I'm not angry. And I'm not going to act on it. I'm just never going to talk to them again, which is acting on it, So, and they say to me, what did the people do in the wilderness? They murmured. And that's always a bad thing. So they're not supposed to murmur. Well, that's not true, but that's how they, so I think the question is, how do we overcome this business of thinking that being angry, the feeling, is sinful? I try to make a distinction between feeling anger and acting on it, but that's not helpful for them.
That's a small question, but let's see what we can do with it in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm not going to actually answer the question.
It's a big one. But please respond.
I'm just going to say I resonate with that. I actually gave a presentation on the Psalms at a church. It was sort of an adult Sunday school, and there was an elderly gentleman who he had served in the church for decades, and he was now an elder in his church, and he fancied himself fairly theologically astute. And I was sharing with him the breadth and scope of the Psalms, or like in this class, and I mentioned the imprecatory Psalms, and I brought up Psalm 109 and displayed it on the screen. And he came up to me afterward and he said, I had no idea that was in the Bible. No idea. I have never seen that. Are you sure that's in the Bible? I'm not sure we're reading the same Bible, right? So I don't know. This isn't much of an answer except to say, I think we can show people places in the Bible where it seems like anger is the appropriate response, or at least it is a response, and it's honored as a human response that we have and we can bring before God. So, but I live in that same world that you do, where, anger is somehow in and of itself is wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. One of the ways the church can help with that is to actually create spaces. You have to do your own work behind the scenes to be sure you know how to do it well. But then fostering a space in which we start to help people really be able to process that in a faithful way, following biblical examples. But yeah, I think, what was I going to say? Modeling it is important, but it is like this really profound barrier where I think we have really marred the ability for the church to speak in certain moments of our history. And I would say one of those is now, where we're not comfortable with righteous anger. And I actually think that's completely unbiblical. It's wholly biblical to have righteous anger, but because we carry these things that block us, we're not standing up in this moment in the ways that we should. So we gotta learn how to do it, and if we can't do it, there's a whole bunch of individual work that's necessary. But I think the church can also try to foster more intentionally how do we really kind of biblically sit together and find that righteous anger. So there is anger that is sinful, but righteous anger, that's not sinful. Yeah.
Final word.
Yeah. like we're in the business of soul formation in our worship and spiritual, how we cultivate character and virtues. And I think someone who did that well was Aquinas. He talked about how behind every anger is a love, a deep love. You've probably heard that one before. And I do think we've lost the ability to disagree well and see the love under what are we loving and holding on to. So returning to Aquinas, returning to the virtues and the vices. You know, when anger spills over into a vice, it's wrath, where you lose control of your reactions.
Yeah.
But God was angry. You know, so what does that mean, and what does that look like? But I think those are the questions we need to be wrestling with in this moment of what is virtuous anger look like, and what is the love behind that when a fellow Christian is really angry and just can't see my position. How can we disagree in a very healthy way and hold together, recognizing that in Christ all things hold? So there's deep soul work to be done in that spot.
Thank you. This has been a really rich and deep conversation. Thank you for your questions. Thanks to each of you for all you brought. Can you join me in thanking them? Thank you.